Our final selection for this week is excerpts from the journal of Sarah Kimball Knight. Knight was a an interesting character. We were very lucky to have this kind of journal. On the one hand, it's something you say, well, this gives us an opportunity to take a look at 18th century life. But it's written by an upper class woman or an upper middle class woman, so it's from that one perspective. But the great thing about the journal is not simply that it provides us an opportunity to hear from a person of a particular class, but it also gives us an opportunity to, because her travels brought her through different areas of New England and encountered people of all different walks of life and different classes and different backgrounds and such. It really is kind of like getting a tour of New England in 1704 and 1705. It really was it's a kind of a cool thing there because, you can have people write about conditions. You can have people write about different people in different towns, but traveling through these different areas, a mixture of people from all walks of life, from educated people, people with property and money, people in cities, all the way through the most rough, rugged, backwoods people you can possibly imagine. And also, I think, makes it much more interesting because at the time, it was a period of time when Native Americans and mostly English colonists, were still living largely in and amongst each other. It wasn't a situation where, European culture had completely, pushed out indigenous people yet. And because of that, you actually get a chance to see what it would be like to live in that environment. She is somewhat worried traveling through rural areas. Obviously, she doesn't want to travel alone ever, but she's not so overly concerned with Native Americans. Encountering them doesn't freak her out or anything like that because it's been part of her life since childhood, undoubtedly, that these are just people that we live in and amongst. Whereas I think, 40, 50 years later, a New Englander, encountering a Native American might be somewhat taken aback because by that time they didn't really see them very often. And so tales from what we would call today the Midwest, at that time the frontier, was something that would have been considerably more exotic than it would have been for their parents or grandparents. So it's a really interesting opportunity to take a look at what was life like, in a period of time right at the turn of the 18th century. So, and what I want to do is I want to highlight the fact that there's a marked change here from that of Mary Rowlandson. Now, I realize that the texts are very different because they're describing very different things. That's not what I'm talking about, though. I'm talking about in terms of the attitude towards life, the outlook that she has, the things that interest her. With Knight, you get very much more urbane, a more urbane person, a greater sense of class distinction. I realize Rowlandson was, farming, rural, small, right there on the frontier. I realize that she didn't have the education that Knight had, but at the same time, the existence of someone like Knight is considerably more possible in 1704 than it would have been even, 20, 30 years earlier. And that needs to be taken into account. What we're looking at when we look at Sarah Kimball Knight is really kind of a newer type of person that is emerging in the colonies. The colonies, you can tell by some of her own adventures out there, are really rough, really rugged. I mean, just traveling the 100 miles she's wanting to go is an ordeal like you've never seen before. I mean, roads that really aren't roads. They're just rocky, paths that are actually hard to even see or find. By the way, the idea that there weren't any roads or there weren't any ways to travel from A to B, that it was all just a bunch of woods and whatnot, ignores the fact that Native Americans who'd lived there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years had regular routes and from place to place all over the place, had paths all over the place. So it's not as though they're just having to, like, cut their way through rainforest that nobody's ever been in. But it's still pretty rough. Very, very rough, in fact. Particularly if you're riding on horseback. Horses were something that Native Americans in New England did not have. And so everything was on foot, for the most part, when Europeans first got there. So whatever transportation routes there were not really built for horses. So you can see that one of the things that really kind of she's comfortable riding on horseback, but not necessarily in that terrain. And particularly, she has a terrible phobia of water. I think understandable. She's like, any minute now I'm going to cross over this river and we're all going to drown and die. She's terrified by it, and you can't blame her. I don't know that it's a phobia. I think it's just actually a rational fear of what could happen to you. But some other things about her that you'll notice, and I'll in a moment I'll go through some passages here with you, but just want to highlight this because think about this. The difference between the way Rowlandson writes, the way Rowlandson looks at reality, the way Rowlandson has what she values and has uppermost in her mind, very different from this journal with Night, because she's interested in other things. She has secular interests. We don't really see that part of Mary Rowlandson. Now I realize the texts are different. I said that, but Night is writing about business, culture, society, not just religious interests. So there's a little bit more of an interest in secular things. And what really probably marks her as being very different from Rowlandson. Rowlandson's book doesn't lend itself to humor. I understand that. But you just get a genuine sense that as a more cultivated, refined, sophisticated, educated woman of means, Night is interested in humor. She likes humor. Her poems reflect humor. Her character sketches, even though they kind of deride people. And by the way, in one instance, we would just outright say that was just a terribly racist thing to say. I'll point that out too. Nevertheless, even though some of her character sketches are designed to kind of poke fun at people, there's at least a sense there of an attempt at humor, and that humor is an appropriate thing, that finding your fellow human beings, even though they may be farther down the social ladder, objects of interest, intrigue, and amusement, is something you wouldn't see in Rowlandson's generation. You don't see it in writings from the previous century. So something important has really changed here. And what I want to point out or highlight here and draw your attention toward is that with Night, we're really starting to get a more modern woman in many regards. Okay, so as you're reading through Night's journal or rereading it or taking a look at some of these passages, I just want you to appreciate the fact that this is a different kind of woman than came a generation earlier here. Let's take a look at a couple of things here. She starts her journey in October of 2004. And if you're using the electronic text, the e-text that I linked here, I have to apologize because some of these have some typographical errors. I apologize for that. It's not been edited much here. We're going with a really rough reprint, if you will, and certainly the spelling is irregular. Spelling remained irregular in the English language well into the 18th century. You just kind of spelled things the way you wanted to spell them until Johnson's dictionary became much more widely circulated. But she makes comments about the drinking habits of people, how when you're on the road, you don't know what kind of accommodations you're going to get. One thing you walk away from is that the food must have been just absolutely awful. There were no hotels. You basically went from town to town or settlement to settlement, or even not even a settlement. I mean, there's a town here, in this place, and then 20 miles away is another town, and in between there's just this guy named Fred who has a house, and he'll let you stay there. And I think he's got an extra bed, maybe. I mean, that's all you had. And by the way, the rough path to his house is a rather dangerous one. You could fall off a cliff or break a foot or whatever. And Fred's kind of set up to do it. He agrees to do it. That's the other thing, is that you might not be in business to be a hotel, but you pretty much needed to, in case someone came along, you pretty much needed to put them up. I mean, it was just the reasonable thing to do. These people are living in quasi wilderness. Somebody comes knocking at your door in the middle of nowhere and says, I need to stay for the night. You may not feel up to it, but you pretty much have a moral obligation to do it, because where else are they going to sleep, right? There's nothing else out there. And, especially if the woman of the house isn't a very good cook, or there's not much to make, or they haven't made anything that evening. I mean, you can't phone ahead, right? They don't have a Trader Joe's to go run out and get some gourmet food. I mean, it's just what they've got on hand. And so, it's catch as catch can. You never know. It's a roulette wheel, right? But she's constantly pointing out things that about the station and the class differences between lower and upper. When she stops at one of the first stops that she makes, she says, Madam turned, right, the woman of the house where she was staying, roaring out, "Lawful heart, John, is it you? How do you do? Where in the world are you going with this woman? Who is she?" John made no answer but sat down in the corner. Some of these people are kind of quiet. They chew tobacco and spit all over the place. The women speak in a way that a woman of her stature just would be appalled, right? "Oh, hey, where'd you get this lady? Where'd she come from?" That kind of thing. It's like, who are you, you rough, hillbilly person, you. But she writes about it in good humor. She doesn't approve of it necessarily, but she's like, well, this is what you got to deal with, because these country folk are rough as a cob. Miss stared a while, drew a chair, bid me sit, right? She was like, I can't believe I come into this lady's house and she doesn't even ask me to sit down. I've been on the road for 10 hours. And she's just squawking and hollering and whatnot. And then run upstairs and put on 2 or 3 rings. This is the daughter who puts on some rings. She's pretty sure she ran upstairs to put on some rings on her finger so that she could come down and show them off. Like, I'm not that poor. I've got something, right? I have fancy stuff too. So the class thing here is really interesting. You would not have gotten much of that in, the writings of somebody in the mid 17th century in this area, because nobody really had much. I mean, there were some wealthy people, but they mostly stayed in the cities. They didn't come out and travel. So once you got out in the countryside, you just didn't have that. So she's really highlighting this growing sense of class in the colonies that really wasn't as fully developed when those colonies were largely religious Puritan settlements, where most people were just plain farmers. There were a few property people, but most were plain old farmers. A couple of things that I want to point out that are kind of fun. She writes a poem to the moon, Fair Cynthia, right? The name that is given to the moon in some circles, right? In literature. She's very glad that the moon comes out because that guides her path. Remember, there's no light. I mean, if you're in a forest in the middle of the night and it's a cloudy night, man, oh man, it is pitch black. You can't find your way. And many times she thinks, where the heck is the person who's riding with me? And remember, and see, I think it's interesting that she has to hire people to go with her from on one leg to another leg to another leg to another leg. And the haggling over the price of that can sometimes be a little bit, concerning, right? Some guy wants to gouge her. Another person's just perfectly fine. One guy, doesn't take it very seriously, doesn't really care about whether she gets there safely or not. Another fellow's just wonderful. It's all kinds of people that she's running into. And notice her poem, she says, "Fair Cynthia," this is the moon, "all the homage that I may unto a creature, unto thee I pay," right? All the respect I can give to a creature, right? A part of creation I give to you. So she's not going to overpraise the moon. She's no pagan, right? I'm not going to praise you more than I would praise God. So she holds back a little bit on that praise. So it's always there. She is clearly a very religious woman, and one that for whom religion is very central to her. It's just that's not her only interest. She has other interests than that. And of course, part of this whole journey is about settling business accounts and an estate and those kinds of things. So this is all about property and business relations. The particularly humorous one is when she's staying at one residence, one inn, if you want to call it that. And right next door to her room, there are some guys drinking real loud and arguing about all kinds of junk, where the word Narragansett comes from. And so she writes a poem to rum. And says, I ask thy aid, O potent rum, to charm these wrangling toppers dumb. Toppers are drinkers. Dumb. Charm 'em dumb. Thou hast their giddy brains possessed, the man confounded with the beast, and I, poor I, can get no rest. Intoxicate them with thy fumes. Oh, still their tongues till morning comes, right? She can't sleep, so she might as well write a poem. Writing for her is entertainment. It isn't just for religious instruction. It isn't just for religious reflection. If you look at the journals of people from 30, 40 years earlier, Samuel Sewall and other people like that, their journal really was designed as a tool for spiritual self-reflection. She sees the journal as an opportunity to write down remarkable, interesting things, amusement, entertainment, passing the time. There was no internet, there was no television, there were no movie theaters, right? And so poetry to her is entertainment. Poetry is not religious in nature. It's not for that alone. For that alone. And I know not, but my wishes took effect, for the dispute soon ended with another dram, and so good night, right? They had one more drink, and out they went. She was like, please, rum, get them drunk and make them go to bed, because I'm really tired. Think about how exhausting physically it must have been to ride horseback all that way. And we're not talking about horseback on a nice, steady animal in a beautiful green pasture that was nice and smooth. These horses are like struggling themselves to make it over this rough, rocky terrain. New England's filled with rocks. She next stops at a place I'm assuming the man's name should have been pronounced DeVille, but she can't help but say, this is the devil's house. I'm telling you, it's just horrible, right? I'm in hell. So she says, quite funny. She's wordplay, right? You don't see wordplay very much for humor's sake, 50 years earlier among Puritan writers. She says, but I question whether we ought to go to the devil to be helped out of our affliction, right? So it's a little kind of a humorous thing, the devil. So it's probably a guy's name is probably DeVille. We made all possible speed to this devil's habitation, but meeting his two daughters, as I suppose twins, they so nearly resembled each other, both in features and habit, and looked as old as the devil himself and quite as ugly. We desired entertainment, but could hardly get a word out of them till with our importunity, telling them our necessity, etc., they called the old sophister, who was as sparing of his words as his daughter had been. These people were really quiet, and the place was awful, and the food was terrible. It really was like living with the devil for a night. And she writes a poem about that too. Keep on, and not at this cursed mansion light. So she says to travelers, hey, whatever you do, don't stop at this place. 'Tis hell, and devils here do dwell. Here dwells the devil, surely this is hell. Nothing but wants. A drop to cool your tongue can't be procured these cruel fiends among. Plenty of horrid grins and looks severe. You know, they grin at you and they look like the devil grinning at you. These are some ugly people. And there's nothing to eat or drink here, no matter how tired you are. You're going to find no comfort in this place. So it's just this, and this continues to go on. She sees some people who are just desperately poor, and even writes a little poem to herself to say to herself, I have to remind myself that no matter how rough my journey is and how much I go through, I'm not going through anything near what these people are going through. I don't think that she identifies with them in that level. She really basically says, thank you, Lord, for not making me like them, which is hardly, the most compassionate thing. But there is at least a recognition there that she is in a blessed position. There is one passage that I want to draw your attention to, that before you fall in love with this gal, and she's a lot of fun. She's interesting. She's funny. She's the kind of person that if you could go back in time, it would probably be a blast to have dinner with her. She'd have some terrific stories to tell. But there are some things about her that you and I, as modern people, would be rather taken back by. Okay. As soon as she tells a story about the weird customs in Connecticut for marriage, the bride and groom get married. They go up they stand together just before they hold hands. It's the custom for the groom to run away. and have to be dragged back to the altar, right? So she says a little too much independent in their. She says that she thinks that they're a little bit too much independent in Connecticut in their principles, and as I've been told, were formerly in their zeal very rigid in their administrations. But that the custom of the groom, feigning cold feet, running away and having everybody drag him back and then getting married is kind of a funny, interesting, fun thing. So she's probably filled with just tons and tons of wonderful stories, like the story of the African-American slave stealing a hogshead. A hogshead, by the way, is a barrel, and it probably was booze, right? Barrel of beer or wine, usually, a hogshead. It's called a hogshead because it's about as big around as a hog's head is. It's a lot of booze. It's like 60 gallons. That's how big the barrel is. So he steals it, sells it to an Indian, and the Indian tries to sell it and gets in big trouble for it. The back and forth makes the local administrators just shrug their shoulders and say, I can't make sense out of these folks. But as soon as we're hearing these wonderful stories, she then remarks and says, the only thing that bothers me is that the farmers in this area, they're slaves, right? And we forget that in New England there was slavery. It wasn't widespread, but there was slavery up until, the close of the century, the 18th century. She says, I don't like the fact that the farmers treat their slaves with too much familiarity. They even let them sit down and eat with them. And she says something that's really an ugly statement here, but too indulgent. Especially the farmers, to their slaves, suffering too great familiarity from them, permitting them to sit at table and eat with them, as they say, to save time, right? Well, it's faster that way. And into the dish goes the black hoof as freely as the white hand, right? She's appalled by the familiarity. She's appalled by the fact that they don't keep distance based on race, but also on status, right? On social class. She's really as upset with the idea of people of inferior class sitting down with people who are their so-called betters, as she is about the race element. But the race element's certainly there. The idea that black people are devils, right? That therefore the hoof, right? The devil's supposed to have hooves, and you can't trust them. And they, and this goes back to this idea that they in Africa they weren't Christian, that they worship different gods and pagan gods, and and Europeans were like freaked out about sometimes what we would call or what has come to be called voodoo beliefs and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of that in it. So as soon as you're ready to say, oh, she's a very modern woman in some respects, it has to be qualified, right? You got to qualify that. A couple of other things that I think are interesting to highlight and point out. There are some language barrier issues here, but She's constantly sort of critiquing her hosts. Some are wonderful, some are not. It's clear she's delighted when she gets an opportunity to stay with somebody of education and class. Ministers primarily are able to take care of her and such. But you even get earthy details, such as in certain parts in Norwalk, Connecticut, I believe it is. The sheep dung is particularly valuable. They make a lot of money off the sheep dung, and in fact, the town pays its minister from the proceeds of all these farmers' sheep dung. And so she says that the minister's pay is literally, pardon my French, sheep shit. That's how they pay his salary. They grudge that, preferring their dung before their minister. They treat him badly. Well, if you pay your minister with sheep crap, you can't. They don't have. So they're very independent. So where you go, she sees different kinds of people. You might think, well, everybody up there is very homogenous, but she sees lots of differences. That you go to this part of Connecticut and you're going to see these kinds of people. Go to this part of Connecticut and they have very different traditions, very different ways of doing things. You can't find an educated person here. Over here, everybody's very cultivated. They've got the latest European style, and it's really a patchwork quilt. And I think that's what makes it so interesting, because she gives a round, unvarnished set of tales, as Shakespeare would say. And what's wonderful is that she's perfectly candid. there's no evidence whatsoever that she intended this journal to be anything but a private diary, and later it was published. And so she's really giving us complete honesty, and as far as we can tell, accuracy. Has no reason not to. Well, what I want you to do is keep Knight in your mind, some of these other writers from this week's selection in your mind, because we're going to be launching out into late 17th century, late 18th, early 19th century material, particularly 2 novels coming next. And we're going to talk about how things are changing, particularly women writers, women characters, and issues that were very important to women then that are obviously important to all of us now, and how those seem to be evolving over time.